Do you like video games? Want to play a bunch of them without paying a lot of money? Well, you may want to consider dabbling in the dark arts with an emulation device like this. Hey guys, MichaelBtheGameGenie here. Thank you so much for checking out the video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Super Console X, an emulation device from KinHank that may be an easy solution for those of you looking to move into the world of emulation. And I'm going to tell you more about it right after this. So that's right guys, today we're going to be taking a look at the Super Console X from KinHank, an emulation device that comes preloaded with a bunch of different consoles and a plethora of games. I want to say a huge thank you to KinHank for sending me out the Super Console X for the purpose of this review. Now, the interesting question is this an easy solution for people that want to get into the world of emulation? Because the system already comes preloaded with pretty much all the cores you're going to need and an abundance of games. So little knowledge is needed to get into emulation. But does the performance hold up that it's going to make you feel like the actual experience, or are there better options out there? Anyways, before we get into that, I want to say thank you very much, everybody, for checking out the video. Guys, I always appreciate your support. If this is your first time to the channel, you like what you see, go ahead, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, all that YouTube stuff. So guys, here it is, the Super Console X. I want to say thank you once again to KinHank for sending me out this console for the purpose of this review. Alright, let's take a look at what's inside the box. So we open it up and there's immediately an instruction manual, it seems, for a PlayStation 2 DualShock controller. I'm kidding, of course. So let's get inside and see what we have. So in the first box, we've got our AC power cord. We have got a USB hub, which is surprising they included that. We've also got an HDMI cable. Thank you very much for including that. Always short on HDMI cables. We've got our instructions for how to use the Super Console X, our manual. And last but not least, we have the device itself, the Super Console X. Looks familiar for some reason. And there you can see the two USB ports, the back where you can put your Ethernet power. Pretty cool. So now we'll take out the controllers, and like I mentioned, these are pretty much DualShock controllers. I'm noticing a rattle from the controller. It feels a little light. It'll be interesting to check this out. And of course, we also have a second controller, so two controllers included. And that's everything in the box. Alright, first off, let's talk about the console itself, and as I said in the unboxing, this looks pretty familiar. That's because the case of the console is modeled after the Super Famicom, which is the Japanese version of the Super Nintendo console. I've always liked the look of it, so I like the look of the case that they put on top of the Super Console X. Then, of course, we have to talk about the controllers, and these are blatant ripoffs of a DualShock controller, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3 controller. I can't put my head around it. But anyways, that's not necessarily a bad thing because those have a great D-pad and it's a really good controller, really comfortable. This one, of course, is very light. I mentioned the rattle inside. If you open it up on the back, that's because it actually has a USB connector in there for the 2.4 gigahertz connection that you're going to be using to connect the controller to the system. And the opening, of course, is provided by the battery slots. Yes, this does not have an internal battery. You have to provide your own batteries. AAA batteries will be required. Now, while these may initially seem rather cheap, don't judge a book by its cover because they actually work pretty well. The buttons all function pretty decently. The D-pad works pretty well. Everything looks good. It's just a little light and it feels a little cheap. But in terms of performance, this will get the job done to some extent. I will say that during gameplay, I have noticed some input latency, and I was getting some really weird effects while trying to play blazing lasers on the TurboGrafx 16 where the buttons weren't moving right. It may be that the AAA batteries were running low, so the inputs were going slow, but I do have to report that. Now let's get into the meat of what this Super Console X can do, because that's what you guys are really interested in. And what does it emulate? Well, it emulates pretty much everything that a Raspberry Pi 3 can. I was very impressed with the assortment of consoles that were there. I will say I immediately went in and games looked good. When I started playing, I did notice the games had a filter on them, and you guys know how I feel about bilinear filtering, softening. I think it absolutely ruins the experience. Luckily, I was able to go into the options and remove that, and the gameplay all looks fantastic. Sound is surprisingly good for emulation device as well, so I was very happy with that. One thing I was very disappointed in is the fact that there seems to be a fixed bezel. Now, the bezels do look good. They have the KinHank branding. They have the console itself, so they don't look terrible. However, most people like options when it comes to bezels. Most people play with bezels off with the black bars on the side of the screen, especially if you're streaming. And unfortunately, there is no option to take the bezel off. I went into the options, I clicked off on bezel, but I just could not remove the bezel from this. I don't know why that isn't an option to remove the bezel. Other than that, I think everything looks really good, but dear God, I wish I could remove these bezels. So for any of you who have watched some of my content before where I talk about emulation devices, one of the things I do is a very simple test involving an NES game. I go immediately to Quickman stage, and if I can beat the Quickman lasers without using the flash beam, if I can have a successful easy run through the lasers, that means that there is very little input delay and there's no issue with the emulation. I will say, using the Super Console X, I had a really hard time doing the Mega Man 2 lasers. I basically had almost no opportunity to get off the first screen. Now, is this a direct result of input delay because of the emulation, or is it because of the 2.4 gigahertz controllers? We'll have to come back to that. Another thing I like to test is I find certain games that don't work on other emulation devices, and for those of you who are like me, have done a bunch of emulation on the NES Classic, if you've hacked it, you know certain games don't work. So I immediately tested out some of the games that don't work. Castlevania 3, I can happily report, does work on the Super Console X, works flawlessly, so no issue there. And also Batman Return of the Joker, one of my favorite NES games, that works as well, no issue there. So kudos to Super Console X on their NES emulation. Everything works like it should. Now, of course, where this console is modeled after the Super Famicom, you better hope the Super Nintendo emulation works well. And I'm happy to say one of the games I tested that doesn't work on the SNES Classic through emulation, Illusion of Gaia, does work flawlessly here, just like a Raspberry Pi, so very good job. Illusion of Gaia is up and running perfectly. And then I went and played one of my absolute favorite Super Nintendo games, Super Castlevania 4. That seemed to work flawlessly as well, so the Super Nintendo emulation is also on spot. In fact, all of the classic console emulations seem to be working really well, but I wanted to test this thing, test its metal, and see how far we could push the limits of the Super Console X, so I wanted to start taking a look at the higher end consoles. First off is PlayStation. PlayStation emulation isn't too taxing, but I did want to see how it worked. I played some Mortal Kombat 4 because it's pretty much locked behind the wall. I'm not going to be playing it on an arcade cabinet anytime soon. So I checked out MK4 on the Super Console X. Happy to report PlayStation emulation works really well. Now, PlayStation emulation also works really well on the Raspberry Pi 3 as well. So not a surprise here, but very happy with the assortment of games they included and how well the emulation worked. Now, what was surprising to me was how far we could push the emulation landscape here, as they also included N64 and Dreamcast, which are two consoles that are typically a little harder to emulate with some of the older single-board computers and the Raspberry Pi 3. So, of course, they have Dreamcast and N64. I immediately put on the Dreamcast because I have such fond memories getting my Dreamcast on launch day, and immediately plugged in Sonic Adventure, and I have to say the experience was fairly good. There were no issues. I did notice some slight, where the models would go in between and things missing, but those were present on the actual Dreamcast as well, so no red flags there so far. Then I went to another launch game that I got very early that I was excited to see on this, which is Soul Calibur, one of the best fighting games on the Dreamcast, something I have so many fond memories with, and unfortunately this is where the emulation kind of falls apart. As you can see in the background, the game plays great, like the experience is good, but some of the background colors, animations, background images started failing. I can't 100% say that this is the Super Console X's fault and not a bad ROM, but it seems like it was struggling trying to run Soul Calibur. Moving on to the N64, and this is always one that I've had a bit of a problem running on single board computers as well, and especially for those of you who remember the Wii emulation. After the Wii was kind of out of circulation, everybody hacked it and put all kinds of different games on it. N64 worked, but only kind of. So first off, I wanted to test kind of a layup game here on the N64, but it's still one of my favorites, and that was Cruisin' USA, and I'm happy to report Cruisin' USA worked really well. Super happy with the experience on Cruisin' USA, so I'll come back and play this game on my Super Console X. But then I moved on to one I knew was more challenging, one I could never get to work correctly on my Wii for N64 emulation, and that was GoldenEye. GoldenEye started out okay, but there was a lot of noticeable slowdown. The system seemed to be chugging along trying to make this work, and then at one point froze up completely to the point I actually had to turn off the console. So while Dreamcast and N64 is certainly possible on the Super Console X, there's no guarantee every ROM will work correctly without graphical issues, and you will run into issues sometimes, like I did with GoldenEye, where it just doesn't want to work at all. So let's talk about the controllers again. I did mention earlier these controllers should get the job done, but they're not perfect. Luckily, the Super Console X connects with a bunch of other controllers pretty flawlessly. Basically, anything that works like an Xbox 360 controller should work on this. 8BitDo is, of course, my favorite brand, so I tested some of those in my collection. The NES style controller I typically use with my Raspberry Pi unfortunately did not work. It worked okay, but I had to input the controls, and when I got to the point of trying to input my right D-pad, everything went to hell, and that was the end of that. I will say, however, the SN30 Pro that I do have, that I got to play retro games on my Switch initially, that one has worked great. I did not have to do any setup. It's basically plug and play. You just stick it in and it will work like it should for playing all the games on the console. So kudos to the Super Console X for making that work. Then moving on to my 8BitDo arcade stick, and I'm so happy this worked because this also does some arcade emulation, and playing arcade games doesn't feel right unless you're playing with an actual arcade controller. I played through some X-Men here and I really enjoyed the experience. Buttons all work like they should. Definite difference in input delay. And speaking of input delay, I want to go back and actually run my Mega Man 2 test again to see if it is the emulator or if it is the controller. So I'm using the SN30 Pro here and doing Mega Man again, and I'm happy to report I can make it through the flashbang lasers. Not as easily as I should be able to, so there still is some input delay on the controls that's based on the emulation, but with a wired controller, the SN30 pad, a good controller, I can get the job done. Last but not least, I wanted to test out to see if this thing could work with other devices. I had heard rumors that you could use the Super Console X with the AtGames Legends Ultimate through OTG, so I plugged it in. I plugged my controller in hardwired, and unfortunately, I could not get the stock control panel to register easily as an Xbox 360 controller. It just didn't come up as a controller. Maybe this works, but it's definitely going to require a lot more thought and effort and options. So it's not a plug and play solution to just stick into your AtGames Legends Ultimate to add more games to that console. You will have to do some messing around. Anyways, guys, that's my look at the Super Console X. This is a device that may be perfect for people that don't want to mess around with emulation, don't want to go looking for ROMs, don't want to find cores and find codes for cores to make certain things work. If you want to buy something and everything just works right out of the box, very simply, this is a perfect console for you. However, if you want that, closest realistic gameplay experience where you want to be able to have perfect timing, like say for example in Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, or like me, want to get past the lasers in Mega Man 2 and have that point-for-point experience right next to the original consoles, this might not be it, as there is some slight input delay. For those of you who want to push the boundaries and get like the higher end consoles on there, this has PSP, this has Dreamcast and N64, but with varying degrees of success. It's an easy one-stop solution for people who want to get into the emulation world, but if you're willing to do a little extra work, there may be some better options out there. Anyways, guys, let me know in the comments, what do you think of the Super Console X? Is this something that you'd be interested in picking up? Or if you have one, what do you think of it? Let me know down below. Anyways, guys, once again, thank you so very much for watching this video. This is Michael B. the Game Genie, and I'll talk to you next time.